please welcome Russ Sobel.
Thank you.
Now you can start.
Thank you. Well, you know, being an economist in West Virginia is a really funny occupation. I'll tell you what. If you have any friends who are medical doctors, they'll tell you that every time they go to a cocktail party, people are always coming up when they find out they're a doctor and asking them for free medical advice. Like, hey, doc, I have this rash. Can you take a look at it? Well, you know, every time I go to a cocktail party in West Virginia and people find out I'm an economist, people are always like, well, why are we so poor? What is it about West Virginia? Why are we so poor? What could we do to fix the West Virginia economy? And, you know, the problem is economics knows the answer to that. It's just not a cocktail party answer. So what I decided to do about 4 years ago was put together a team of 25 scholars from across the country, mostly PhD economists, but also some graduate students and some legal scholars to help me put together an edited volume called Unleashing Capitalism. And this book right here is the result of our efforts, and it contains some very good policy reforms that are applicable to all states, not just West Virginia, in terms of how to really take the ideas that we have in our field of economics and apply them to state public policy. So the book has done very well. It's had a pretty big impact on the state. It's sold over 5,000 copies. I've given about 200 public presentations of this around the state to various different groups, from the Auto Dealers Association to Rotary clubs to all sorts of to groups. I've been lucky enough to present it to 2 different state governors. And the book also won the Sir Anthony Fisher Award for the best public policy book of the year it came out. So my talk today is going to be based on that book. What I'd like to do, though, is start out with my very favorite slide, and I apologize, this is the only dark one, so you'll be able to see the others a little bit better. I might just actually flip that out for 10 seconds so you can see it a little better. This is my very favorite picture. I think most of you have probably seen this picture. It's a satellite photo of the Earth at night. And you know, when we look around the globe, it's really shocking. There's some places that are bright and shining with prosperity and wealth. And then sadly, there's some other places on the face of the globe that remain dark, dim, and impoverished. And you know what economics at its core has been about for the last 200 years is trying to figure out why. What causes these differences in prosperity? Why do some places grow rich and others not grow rich? And we've considered a lot of hypotheses, but the one that keeps hanging around with us is Adam Smith, the father of economics. More than 200 years ago, in 1776, he set out to answer this question in his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And over 200 years ago, what he concluded is it really is the policies and the system of the economic organization of these countries that matters more than things like resources and geography. And that's really important, particularly with regard to West Virginia, because if you ask the average West Virginian why they're so poor, the answers would be things like, we don't have enough resources, we're landlocked, we have mountains, our climate's bad. They want to blame it on geographic factors and resource-related factors rather than the policies of the state. And you know, what we know from economic research is that those things might matter a little bit, but they certainly don't matter that much. We see places like Hong Kong and Japan that are a little more than volcanic islands out in the ocean that are able, with zero resources essentially, to produce a standard of living as high as we have in the United States, while there's places like Argentina and Venezuela that have abundant resources and they're not very rich. And in fact, the irony, right, is that West Virginia is one of the most resource abundant of the 50 states. And we're also the poorest. So resources certainly aren't the key to economic growth. It's really about policies and how good your policies reflect market principles. Economists actually have a ranking, some of you might be familiar with, that ranks the countries of the world based on their reliance on market-based institutions, based on capitalism. And you can even see the striking visual resemblance between the scores the countries get in this index and the graphic I showed you of the world at night. It's the places that are blue, that embrace capitalism, that are ones that are bright and shining, and it's the ones that are red who don't embrace market principles and the things that in economics we know are important, that are dark and dim and impoverished. Now, the most important thing, I think, for people to understand the basic argument being made for what creates growth is the following slide. This is kind of my nutshell way of trying to communicate to people how an economist views an economy. Every economy starts out with some inputs and resources to work with, and we try to turn them into the outcomes that we want. But what's in the middle here, the rules of the game or the government policies, is what I want to talk about today. You can think about this process very similar to baking cookies or cakes. You've got some ingredients, you stick them in the oven, this is the oven, and out the other end you produce delicious, yummy cakes and cookies. And here's fundamentally the problem. If the oven isn't turned on, you can shovel ingredients into it all day long and you don't get anything out the back. There's no net product to show from it. And this is the reason why places like West Virginia, who have abundant resources to work with, can't produce the necessary prosperity from them, is that the problem isn't that we have a lack of resources. The problem is that we need to get our oven turned on. We don't have our policy structure right to make the most productive use of those resources and turn them into real wealth. And the problem with a misunderstanding of the way the economy works means that most of the policies that we followed in West Virginia and other places around the globe to try to get more of this is to shovel more ingredients in. West Virginia has been the recipient of massive inflows of federal aid for decades to try to do things. There's all these, the state government in West Virginia just wants to go around doing things to try to put more resources on the table, and it's not working, and they keep doing it anyway. Here's one of my favorite examples. About 40 years ago, West Virginia undertook one of the most expensive road construction projects in the nation that year. What they did is they took this two-lane little road that went all the way across the state and made it into a 4-lane divided highway. The politicians put their names up on the signs, But here's what it looks like. That road has been there for now about 40 years. And I guess I should have said, because it's an important part of this, that it was so costly, they had this debate over whether it was a good use of money. The justification given for building this road is it would create a path of economic development across our state. The problem is you don't have infrastructure, and all you need is some roads, and we'll have this path of economic development across the state. There's quotes like that on the debate, and you drive down the road for an hour and a half, you see not another car on the road. The problem is that there was no trucks on that road 30 years ago. And there's still no trucks on that road today, and you don't solve it by making it 4 lanes. And I joke that what we're doing with the stimulus money is making it a 6-lane road. That has no effect on prosperity. What we need to do in West Virginia is get the companies there who can use these resources in productive ways to transport goods and services. It's not a lack of roads, it's a lack of people using the roads that's the problem. So, if you want to know what we did do with our stimulus money, just to show you we are using it wisely, here's what we've done. We've now installed tenth-of-a-mile markers all around the state. So you drive down the road, and not only are they any tenth-of-a-mile marker, they're personalized, monogrammed. I-79 South, 122.6. And so it's every tenth of a mile. This is really valuable in the days with GPS and all the things, cell phones, this is brilliant. And the funny thing is not only do they want to make sure you know where you are on the interstate, every on and off ramp has these signs right here. I was too scared to stop on a real one, so I apologize that it says rest area, but I promise every exit, it would say like exit 122 and be like this. But keep in mind, you might not have seen the first one. So they've made sure that they put up at least 3, and in some cases, 4 of those identical, I did not do that. 4 of these identical signs on every on and off ramp around the state. But these are the kind of programs that West Virginia does to try to grow, and it's really sad in some respects that really the public policy structure in West Virginia thinks this is the path to economic development, is just trying to shovel more spending into the economy. Returning to the world at night picture, the one place on there to look to really see what's going on is the case of North and South Korea. If you can't see it well enough there, here's a blow up of the difference in the lights at night between North and South Korea. And if you don't know it, here's what really matters. Now, in the Economic Freedom of the World Index, North Korea ranks near the dead bottom of it, while South Korea ranks among the top 20 most free market economies in the world. And the reason this is such a good example is fundamentally North and South Korea start out the day with the same set of ingredients to bake their cakes with. I mean, they used to be the same country. They've got a common culture, a common history, virtually the same access to ports and climate and geography. I mean, really, the difference in the prosperity here, which you can see in the lights at night, is certainly reflected in the level of per capita income. The average person in South Korea is about as rich as the average West Virginian, while the average North Korean is about as rich as the average African. This is all a difference based on economic policy differences between those two places. And this is how much the policies matter relative to the resources. Now, the states also differ on their reliance on capitalism, just like countries of the world, now not to as large of an extent, but certainly we have different regulatory policies, different tax policies. So building on the Economic Freedom of the World project, they've come out with an Economic Freedom of North America project that ranks all the states and the Canadian provinces in terms of their reliance on capitalism. So now you can look at that. If you can't see what the colors mean, red means it's the least reliant on capitalism. So you fundamentally ask, why do you think West Virginia is so poor? Well, I don't know. Guess where we rank in that index? We've ranked dead 50th in that index since its inception back in the 1980s. We are the least economically free of all 50 U.S. states. And I'll give you some of the details on this a little bit later, but it's really scary when you take this and combine it with the Economic Freedom of the World report and you adjust us down from where the U.S. is. Essentially, Estonia and Latvia have more economic freedom than the state of West Virginia. And these are former Soviet republics that basically were 100% socialism a couple decades ago. And it's really surprising that they can have policy structures today that are more conducive to capitalism than a state like West Virginia. Now, how do we get the bottom of this ranking? Well, there's a whole lot of things, and I'll talk about them as we move forward. But just to throw out one that should help you understand how you can get so low in an index like this, the average free market economy in the world has about, 20 to 30% government spending. You want to take a guess at what West Virginia's government spending is as a share of its economy? 52%. We're one of only 2 states in the nation where there's less resources left for the private sector than are consumed by the government sector. It's very hard to get private sector growth when you do that. So what we've done is turned ourselves into a South Korea. This is the level of per capita income in West Virginia. We're at the bottom of the barrel. Actually, I should update this because Louisiana was only below us that one year because of Katrina. They've jumped back above us. So we're usually, right at the bottom of all these rankings. The average West Virginian only earns about 75% of the U.S. average. We're falling behind other states. This is one of my favorite graphs that I think a lot of people don't know. For the last 10, this is West Virginia's ranking in per capita income among the 50 states since they started keeping that data in 1929 was the first year they started doing this. Everybody knows West Virginia's poor, and we've been bobbling between 48th and 49th for the last 15 years. But what a lot of people don't know is that West Virginia actually was a middle income state. Back in the 1930s, we were an average state. And, when you're wondering what happened in West Virginia, this graph has a lot to say. If this was how, let's say you were a NASCAR fan and you kept track of your driver's position in the race, and he started out in 30th, and then by the end of the race he'd fallen to the back of the pack and stayed there, what would be your hypothesis on his problem and what's wrong with him? Well, it's not that he got in a wreck. That would look fundamentally different. If we had one governor who came in and messed everything up, it would just be this drop. That's a picture of a car who's driving like 2 miles an hour slower than everybody else on the track, right? So every lap you're getting passed by one more car. And that's fundamentally West Virginia's story. Over the last 80 years, we've been growing, just not as fast as the other 49 states. So every year, one more passes us by. It's a problem of growth is the problem in West Virginia. Here's a real concrete example for you. If you rewind 2 generations ago, 1965, this is adjusted for inflation. The average West Virginian was equally as rich, basically, as an average person from Georgia, and actually slightly richer than the average person in North Carolina. Fast forward 40 years to today. Now the difference is so big, the average family in North Carolina and Georgia earns, as per person, so it's $5,000 of per capita income, 2.5 people per family. We're talking a difference of like $12,500 in family income that's manifested itself just in the last 40 years. And this is all, of course, due to the different rates of economic growth. Places like Georgia and North Carolina have been able to sustain over that 40-year period growth rates of like 2.5%. West Virginia's grown at 1.4%. So the key really is this rate of economic growth. And what we know from economics is that small differences in the rate of growth over very long periods of time really add up. So really the key of trying to grow isn't about getting a new factory in your state this year. It's about growing at 0.1% more every year for 40 years. And that's a fundamentally different economic development strategy. But that's really the strategy we need to do if we want to catch up. Here's West Virginia's future, depending on our rate of growth. This is today. This is our true level, historical level of income. If we keep growing at 1.4%, we follow the bottom line. But if we could get our growth up by 0.5 percentage point, or even a full percentage point, look at the huge difference 1 and 2 generations out in the standard of living. And what West Virginia needs to do to become a rich state, what other states need to do to become rich, is understand that this is a long-run process and focus on getting the rate of economic growth up so that in 1 or 2 generations you have something to show for it. So what policies would help West Virginia? So these are basically, there's 12 chapters in the book that suggest policy reforms, and I'm going to run through kind of a menu of reforms in 5 basic areas. First is that we need to better reward productive activities. Bill Baumol has this really cool idea. about entrepreneurship. He says that every economy has about the same number of entrepreneurs. The difference across states or across countries is where those entrepreneurs choose to spend their time and talents. His theory is that people choose between being productive private sector entrepreneurs or between being entrepreneurs in, say, the political or legal in arenas. And it's all based on the rate of return. So if you really want to increase entrepreneurship and productivity, what you want to do is make sure the rewards to the productive activities are high and the rewards to the unproductive activities are low. So here are some things that we could do embracing that idea to try to better reward productive activities. The first is taxes on capital investment. This is a feller buncher used in the forest industry in West Virginia. Technologically, a logger has two ways they can harvest timber: with a chainsaw or riding in the air-conditioned cab of this feller buncher. It has tank treads. This is a round saw blade, and those are arms. With one of these, the driver can manipulate this thing and go up and grab a tree. As it grabs it, it severs it. And he can grab 4 or 5 at a time, turn them around, lay them in a nice, neat pile on the skid road for the skidder to harness up and take away. With one of these machines, a logger can be 6 times as productive in a day as he can as if he operates a chainsaw. And these aren't very hard to use. Virtually, kind of the old things you see about the foreign workers sitting outside Lowe's looking for work. That's the logging industry in West Virginia. Loggers on a daily basis try to get hired by these little entrepreneurial businesses to go out and log for them. If they're lucky enough to get with an operation that has a feller buncher, they earn 5.5 times as much per hour because of the increase in productivity associated with the capital equipment that they're able to control at their job. Problem is, West Virginia has some of the highest and heaviest taxes on capital investment in the nation. We have a business franchise tax that only one other state has that is basically a tax on business assets. And then on top of it, we have one of the highest rates of personal property taxation on capital equipment in the nation. And this is very hard for us because 2 of the states right bordering West Virginia, if you located this feller buncher in their state, you would pay 0 property taxes on it. And, property taxes are particularly hard on capital equipment because, say, this is a $1 million machine. I mean, that's how much this costs. This cost $1 million. The first year you get taxed some percent of that million, but then year 2 rolls around and it's now worth depreciated, $900,000. You got to pay the tax all over again, and then $800,000. You pay it all over again. And so economists have identified 2 problems with high taxation of capital equipment. First, you get less of it in your state. But second, people tend to hold on to capital equipment longer than they should and not updating it. Because once the thing is depreciated and it's 10 years old, the taxes have finally gone down, and you may run a logging company and you're on the bathroom in the morning reading your logger magazine and you see an ad for a brand new feller buncher. More productive than the one you got. But you think, man, if I do buy that new one, this tax process starts all over again. So people tend hanging on to capital, equipment longer, so we end up with an older capital stock. This kills worker productivity, it kills wages, and something needs to be done about it. Another good example of how we could better reward productive activities is with welfare reform. Here's the way the welfare system works in West Virginia. If you don't hold any employment, you qualify for about 5 different welfare programs that total $11,026 in benefits. But here's the kicker. We could argue all day long about whether that number's too high or too low. So I don't want you to focus on that. Here's what I want you to focus on. Suppose this person gets offered a part-time job earning $6,000. Well, you know how welfare systems work. As you start earning, they start cutting your benefits, as they should. The problem is because we have all these programs that don't coordinate and talk to one another. Once you run the numbers, here's what happens. On your first $6,000, they cut $6,012 in benefits. So your net income actually goes down by accepting a part-time job coming off welfare in West Virginia. And then it doesn't get much better. A full-time job in West Virginia for a low-skilled worker only pays $4,000 more than not working at all. And given any reasonable assumptions about child care expenses, the cost of getting to and from work, the problem is we're facing these people with extremely high tax rates for productive activities. And it's funny because the debate usually doesn't go like this. The debate usually goes like this. We have one of the lowest rates in the nation of welfare recipients actively seeking work. Less than 1 in 4 people on welfare seeks work in West Virginia. They just stay on welfare. And usually people say it's because our people in West Virginia are lazy. They don't care about getting a job. But I don't know about you, but when you look at the economic incentives that they confront, I think it's a little bit more than laziness that's causing them not to hold employment opportunities. On the flip side, we need to make sure that unproductive stuff doesn't pay too much because you draw too many resources in that. That is excessive lobbying or lawsuit abuse. West Virginia not only scores very poorly in the Economic Freedom of North America report, but rankings of the legal systems of the 50 states put West Virginia at the dead last in the legal system rankings as well. We don't have the rule of law, as you might know of it in Virginia. I always joke whenever I get over here to Virginia that the biggest mistake we made was breaking away from your laws. Can we please have them back? Will you please just let us have your laws back? Anyway, so we have a follow-up book to Unleashing Capitalism that's all about the rule of law, about how legal reforms could better improve the West Virginia economy as well. But just to give you just a basic idea of some of the problems that we have in West Virginia in our legal system, about half the states in the nation appoint judges, the other half elect judges. The problem is among the half the states that elect judges, only a handful, including West Virginia, still force the judges to run as Ds and Rs, Democrats, partisan elections, to accept a political platform, run based on a political platform. So if you've never seen the West Virginia Supreme Court political ads, I think you would be shocked as a person who believes in the rule of law. You'll have a candidate get on TV and saying, I'm a Democrat running for the court. If you elect me, I will be pro-labor. And you have a Republican getting on saying, if you elect me, I will be pro-business on the court. So we get a lot of money behind this. You have to be endorsed by the party. If you're not a Republican Democrat, no party will endorse you. So our Supreme Court and court system in West Virginia is very politicized. And that detracts from its ability to really have an unbiased and fair legal system for the resolution of contracts and disputes. We also have very lax venue requirements, meaning it's very easy to move cases anywhere you want in the state or even into the state from other states. So there are a few districts in West Virginia that are single judge circuits that all the cases get moved to because the lawyers and the citizens there tend to be very anti-business in the southern coal counties. Basically, there's a couple counties whose comparative advantage is in lawsuits in our state. And it's very easy to get things moved there from other areas. But here's the one I want to spend some more time on, because I think this is really what makes a free market economist so fundamentally different from a pro-business Republican. Avoiding targeted tax credits and subsidies. Now, most business people suggest, oh, the way we get more business is by giving tax breaks for this industry, for high tech, whatever. But the problem with that is that when you start giving out special favors, what you end up doing is drawing a ton of resources into lobbying for new special favors. And that detracts from the amount of resources available for productive activities. One of my very favorite examples that I want to share from you from West Virginia along this lines is we have 4 pages of exemptions from our state sales tax. One of them is for Girl Scout cookies. Would you like to know how that got there? I happen to know the story. The Girl Scouts spent 3 days over in our capital, Charleston, West Virginia, lobbying the legislature, giving them free what? Cookies, to try to get them to pass this special sales tax exemption for Girl Scout cookies. Now, I don't blame the legislature. I couldn't have said no to the Girl Scouts either. I would have voted for it too. But here's the problem. So what happens is last Christmas, the Boy Scouts come to my door selling wreaths, and I bought one and I had to pay sales tax on it. How fair is that? I'm giving this exact speech in Beckley, West Virginia. Afterwards, the head of the West Virginia Boy Scouts comes up to me and he says, I know, it's so unfair, isn't it? He said, but don't worry, we're planning Boy Scout days at the legislature next year to try to get our exemption. Now, I want to use that to tease out 2 very important things that you have to understand if you want to understand the Baumol argument. First off, when the Girl Scouts spend 3 days in Charleston lobbying, we're giving up 3 days of productive activities they could have been doing. What else could the Girl Scouts could have been doing that would have been productive and wealth creating? Selling the darn cookies, right? Helping old ladies across the road, learning how to build campfires. There's a direct opportunity cost of them spending their time there. But second, and more importantly, from a macro sense, what it means is that every little group now has to spend resources to get the favors. It would be much better to start off passing from day one an exemption for all youth nonprofits at once. And what that would do is minimize the amount of favor seeking that's going on for special favors. And this is one of our problems, is that we tend to play a lot of favorites, and that sucks people into the political process. Area number 3, rely on entrepreneurial discovery, not central planning, to guide the state economy. During my last presentation at the West Virginia legislature, in fact, Professor Coyne was there, you may remember the wonderful questions and answers, the questions we got from the audience. There was a legislator in the back of the room who's convinced that, what was it, switchgrass was the name of it, is the future of our economy, because it can be turned into ethanol, right? So don't you think, he goes off on this 10-minute rant about how the government should be subsidizing switchgrass in West Virginia. He's convinced he can centrally plan our future there in West Virginia. When fundamentally in economics, we know that's not the way it works. The profit and loss system needs to find the best use of our resources, not somebody in the legislature. You know, capitalism is a process where we undergo continuous change. And as long as the process is working well, the failures aren't bad because they're replaced with new things. I mean, you think of North Carolina, they've basically lost their tobacco industry, their textile industry, their furniture industry, yet they're up at the top of the rankings because they've been able to rejuvenate themselves in new areas. The problem is West Virginia's losing stuff and nothing new is coming up to replace it. The entrepreneurial engine in West Virginia is not on to replace the things that are going away. Now, the critical thing to understand is just an average person about this process is that there's fundamentally no way to predict or to try to guess where the future is going. You have to let people discover the future. That is, the focus of state policy shouldn't be on trying to guide things, but on enabling people to discover the future that we don't know exists yet. You know, when my daughter was 1 year old, I took her to a baby birthday party because my wife couldn't go. And I was the only dad at this baby birthday party. And what happened was I set my daughter down on the floor. She's 6 months old, drooling baby. She's not very smart yet, but she is today, so everything came out okay. But at 6 months, you know, you don't know much. There's this Fisher-Price toy that's got 4 balls and 4 holes, red, blue, yellow, green. And, you know, between sticking them in her mouth, she actually put all 4 balls in the right holes. I'll never forget the look on the woman's face sitting across from me. Her eyes must have gotten that big. And she says, "What are the odds of that?" And I looked at her and I said, 1 in 24. And, you know, that's why economists don't get invited to many baby birthday parties, as we know those, right? But why that's an important example is, I mean, even if the economy only had 4 resources, there would be 24 possible ways to arrange those 4. And that's not even counting sub-arrangements of just subsets of 3 or 2. I mean, we know the economy has way more than 4 resources. If we had 52 resources, you may know the story that every time you shuffle a deck of cards, you're getting a new combination of cards that never existed before in human history. If you haven't seen this, look it up on the web. The math of it is impossible. If every human ever alive did nothing but shuffle cards 1,000 times a second for their entire life without sleeping, we still wouldn't be about 20% of the way through the number of ways to arrange a deck of cards. So, I mean, you know, in theory, you could randomly shuffle it and get it, but, you know, the point is, with 52 resources, there's almost an infinite number of new entrepreneurial ideas. What a system, an economic system, has to do is find a way to encourage entrepreneurs to search through that big pile very quickly and give them quick feedback on which ideas work and which ones don't so they can move on. And that's what the profit and loss mechanism is about. It's about letting entrepreneurs try these. And this process cannot be centrally planned or directed because it has to be discovered within the marketplace. The reason is simply nobody knows. I don't know if you know these quotes, but they're fantastic. Digital Equipment Corp, for those of you who are a little bit younger, was the forefront of the computer industry in the 1970s. Ken Olsen would have been viewed back then like a Bill Gates' well, maybe a Steve Jobs today. My examples are even getting more old. But anyway, here's what's so funny about this. In 1977, Popular Mechanics asked Ken Olsen, who is like the leader of the burgeoning computer industry, "Hey, Ken, what do you see about the future of the computer industry?" From his interview in Popular Mechanics magazine, here's the quote: "There's no reason anyone would ever want a computer in their home." Now, how could he have been so wrong? I mean, this is a guy in the best position to know the future of his own industry. How could he be so far off? Well, the answer is actually pretty obvious, right? What did computers look like in 1977? They were the size of this room, and all they did is crunch numbers. Do you want one of those in your home? No, me neither. Who could have possibly foreseen that would turn into this little laptop where you can check the weather, meet your potential spouse, learn how to build a bomb, view explicit pornography? I mean, nobody could have ever thought that box would turn into this, right? You know, and you know, and for the students in the room, this one's just for you. If you don't know Fred Smith's story, Fred Smith is the founder and CEO of FedEx. He came up with the idea when he was a student, a senior, undergraduate student. He went to Yale, not a bad school, right? So here's the way the story unfolds. He shows up for his senior management class, strategic management class. His professor, this Yale professor, is the nation's leading expert on business plan kind of stuff. And his professor says, look, for your grade for the semester class, you have to come up with an idea for a new business, write up a business plan, and turn it in. So Fred Smith goes back to his dorm room, comes up with the idea for FedEx, writes up the business plan, and turns it in. To this day at speeches, Fred Smith still holds up that business plan and reads what his professor wrote in red ink on it. And here's what it is. Here's what his professor wrote on it. The concept's interesting and well-formed, but in order to earn better than a C, the idea must be feasible. Fred Smith got the second lowest grade in his class that year on the business plan for FedEx. Now this story, because Fred Smith uses it so much, is turned into something a little bit bigger than this, because they've actually interviewed his professor, and they're like, dude, what were you thinking? You know, how could you find, you know, and his professor, it's so funny because it's just like my other story. His professor says, you've got to understand, at the time Fred Smith turned this in, the U.S. Postal Service had been in operation for almost 200 years. It doesn't even have to run at a profit. It can be tax subsidized. It's got an office in every city in America, this huge infrastructure. It can't even deliver packages overnight. And here I have this undergrad student who was probably out too late drinking last night, saying he can solve this problem that even the government can't solve after hundreds of years. He said, that's what I was thinking. Now let me ask you, would you invest in that group of people if they came ask for money? You may recognize that one. That's Bill Gates. This is Microsoft's first company picture. You may have heard that if you had invested early on with Microsoft, you'd be rich today. It is true. The irony of that story is that they were begging people to give them money, and they couldn't find investors. They had a very difficult time getting people to trust them to give them money for this idea of something new that nobody'd heard of. You know, usually when you give your life savings to a group of guys that looks like that, they go off and do drugs with it. You know, and you know, these people went off and changed the world as we know it. Now, do you think our state economic development agency is going to favor these people? No. I mean, this isn't where government subsidies for entrepreneurship go. I mean, these are the least likely people, the crazy college students, the crazy entrepreneurs. This is what drives the future, and this is what drives prosperity. So what do we need to do to policies to promote and unleash this? First, you got to avoid interfering with the profit and loss mechanism, so you allow bad things to go away, freeing up those resources for other things. You want to avoid regulating prices and wages so that market signals can drive the allocation of resources. You want to try to privatize or reduce choice whenever possible in the provision of government goods and services, snow removal, schools, whatever. To get entrepreneurship going in our schools would fundamentally change the way the world works. You know, when schools could compete for students with one another instead of being so monopolistic. Don't want to impose barriers that limit people's ability to enter and compete with other entrepreneurs. Here's what it looks like in West Virginia when you walk into a typical business. Now, let me be a little more clear on which business this is. This is a convenience store. And maybe I need to tell you they don't do open heart surgeries there. This is just a normal convenience store. Count them with me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. This is on the wall by the bathroom. Then I went out front, and sure enough, there's 2 more on the front window. The only reason they're there is it says must be posted on front window. So where were we at? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 13 permits to open a gas station in West Virginia. And you wonder why we don't have entrepreneurship? In other states, it only takes 2. I mean, you basically have to be a multinational corporation. Well, not multinational, but I mean, what a process like this does is it gives favors to the Targets and Walmarts over the small mom and pop entrepreneurs. Because Targets and Walmarts have a legal department and a tax staff that can handle this process. A small mom and pop entrepreneur cannot get themselves through this process to get a business open. And it's so sad because every one of these was passed with the best of intentions to make sure things were safe and clean and all this stuff. But the side effect is it just crushes the very process that you need to discover the future of your state. Area 4, reduce government size, growth, and centralization. The goal should be to increase the share of the state economy controlled through the private sector. The problem is that spending programs are notoriously difficult to cut once they're in place. Therefore, one of the most important things is focusing on constraining the growth of new programs. And you know, the problem in West Virginia, like I showed you earlier, is that our private sector has been growing at 1.4%. You want to see what our government spending is growing at? It's growing at about 7% a year. In fact, we've doubled state government spending on a per capita adjusted for inflation basis in a matter of 10 years here, 15 years. You know, the problem is what's going on in West Virginia is our private sector is growing at like 1%, our government's growing at 7%. So guess what happens to the share of the economy held by government through time? Just balloons, right? What we need to do is reverse that. So we get private sector growth up to 4%, government growth down to 1%, and then we can start eating away at the chunk of the government consumption as a share of our economy. But believe me, West Virginia's poverty is not due to a lack of government spending in our state. Finally, overall spending can also be reduced and made more effective by decentralizing government. In economics, we know that decentralized government structures work better than centralized government structures. Unfortunately, when you look at the ratio of state spending to local spending, West Virginia is the second most centralized state in the nation. Virtually everything in West Virginia is done as a statewide policy. Here's one that you may kind of be familiar with bordering West Virginia. They mandate all teacher salaries across the state are the same. What that means is in the Eastern Panhandle, the schools who are competing in the D.C., Maryland labor market pay the same wages as the ones in rural West Virginia where everybody's unemployed. What that means is when they advertise a position, in southern West Virginia, on average, they'll get 500 applicants for one teaching position, where in the Eastern Panhandle, they'll sometimes get none. The problem is they don't allow individual areas of our state to set the policies that would best suit them. And instead, we want to do all this one-size-fits-all stuff. And I have a research paper I just completed in this last year that took measures of decentralization and actually took all those business climate rankings and said, is there a relationship? And sure enough, it's true. The more decentralized your state, the better your business climate is. And so that would also help. The very last thing I want to talk about today is about increasing the security of property rights and imposing checks on the regulatory environment. Private property rights are the cornerstone of a market economy. And abuses of private ownership tend to destroy wealth and harm this process. One of the biggest problems that we have going on in West Virginia is eminent domain abuse. You may remember the Kelo Supreme Court decision. For those of you who weren't familiar with that, what happened is in New London, Connecticut, the Pfizer Corporation wanted to expand into a neighborhood. They made offers to the homeowners who turned down the offers. So then Pfizer went to the local government and said, will you eminent domain those properties and give them to us? And they said, yes, we sure will. So they proceeded to eminent domain a neighborhood to hand it over to Pfizer Corporation. Ms. Suzette Kelo, one of the homeowners, took them to the U.S. Supreme Court and lost. Turns out that the argument that eminent domains should only be done for public use is checked off by the idea that this is going to increase tax revenue for the local government, which can be used to produce public goods for everybody. So therefore, as long as it increases tax revenue, you can get a public use benefit argument out of it. Well, the nice thing is in the dissenting Supreme Court opinion, they said states are free to restrict their own internal use of eminent domain. About half the states in the nation within 3 months of the Kelo decision passed outright bans on private-to-private transfers using eminent domain. West Virginia had a law that was looking like it was going to get passed, got gutted through amendment right at the end by the Charleston Urban Renewal Authority, which is the biggest abuser of this. So anyway, we still have a lot of private-to-private transfers going on through our eminent domain process. And there's a lot of different areas like environmental property takings that really mess with our property rights in the state. There's nothing more important than property rights to economic development, I think. And I always try to convince my students of that by telling them I can guess what's in your refrigerator back in your apartment. If it's anything like my college days, if I went out and bought a bunch of beer and pizzas and stuck them in my fridge and then I went off to class and came back and opened it up, there'd be nothing in there because my roommates would have drank and ate it all while I was gone. And what that means is nobody had an incentive to stock the fridge with anything because it was common property. And I tell my students one of the best things about graduating from college is you finally get your own refrigerator. I've got, some fancy Sam Adams beer and some heat-up Buffalo Bites back in my refrigerator right now in West Virginia. And the reason I'm willing to do that is because I know, even though I'm here for a couple days, when I get back home, I'm going to open the refrigerator door, and guess what? It's still going to be sitting there. And that's what you have to make sure is that the property rights are secure so people can feel free to invest. And if without secure property rights, you don't get that kind of investment. And the very last thing is that regulation should have some sort of process of cost-benefit test or some sort of standard of proof of effectiveness. The problem with regulatory policy is that there's no profit and loss mechanism to get bad regulations off the books, even ones that don't achieve their intended goal. I'll give you a good example from West Virginia. About 4 years ago, the legislature was worried that cab drivers were staying on the roads for too long, being too fatigued, causing too many accidents. So the legislature, in their infinite wisdom, passed a law saying you can only lease a cab for a maximum of 9 hours a day, which is 8 hours to drive, half hour on either side to pick up and return your cab. Cabbies before that were leasing them for a 24-hour period. So all of a sudden, the rules of the game changed. The stated intent of this policy is to reduce cab accidents. Well, we got the data. It's in the book. You want to take a guess what happens to cab accidents? It doesn't take a rocket scientist, but it does take some knowledge of incentives to figure this out. Put yourselves in the shoes of the cab driver. You used to have your cab for 24 hours. You took breaks, ate with your family, went to your kid's soccer game, then you drove during the busy parts of the day. Now you have 8 hours to make your whole day's living. What do? Take no breaks, drive faster, right? And by the way, the number of cabs on the road in West Virginia has fallen off by 20%. So you could also tease through all the secondary effects of you can't get a cab from downtown when you're drunk anymore, and the increased drunk driving. But let's even put that aside. Even if you just look at number of cab accidents in West Virginia, it goes up the day this law passes. By any measure, even the proponents of the law's measure, it's failed to do its job. It's been in the book now for 3 years. I've given this speech 200 times. How can't we get this off the books, right? I mean, it's so clear this needs to get off the books. And so I asked legislators that. And they said, well, you just don't understand. We have so many important things to deal with. We've got this financial crisis. We've got unfunded liabilities. We don't have time to go back and take that little stupid law off the books. And that's the problem, is that they're always so busy, they don't have time to go back and get stuff off the books. We don't force regulations to subject themselves to follow-up analysis and proving they're effective. Wouldn't the world be a different place if we forced regulations to have to fight to stay in place through use of evidence and data? That is, force them to make their way back onto the agenda to get reapproved or they go off the books. Sunset laws, for example, that can help to get some of these off the books when they're not effective. Anyway, I appreciate your time today, and I'll be happy to take some questions and answers. Thank you so much.